Welcome to User Groups Live, here in London and around the world. My name is David Smith, Vice President of the Operational Excellence Group here at Anaplan. I've been here for about 6 years, coming up for that, and what's been apparent to us in the last few years is as our customers have scaled their use of Anaplan and used larger and larger data sets, that we needed to give more guidance on the techniques you can use in Anaplan. There are lots of different ways of modeling in Anaplan, and some of those don't scale as well as other ones. So we set out a couple of years ago to look at all these options to give you the best guidance on using Anaplan the most efficiently in all of your modeling, not just when you're looking to scale. So the Planual is the physical manifestation of our standard. The standard itself is a set of rules around model building. And it will evolve. This is essentially our initial cut of it, based on what we know. And as Lee showed you just now, we're evolving our platform. So as we evolve our platform, we will also evolve the standards. And we're still learning. You know, the standards came about because we were finding things out that not a lot of us knew from the beginning. You know, it's still a fairly young company, still a fairly young product. So we're still finding out what you want to do with our product, and then what the best ways to model that in Anaplan. So I'll say at the outset, these are guidelines, these are rules, and it's a balancing act. As in most model building, you have to make a choice sometimes, so you have to compromise. But we try and look at three main areas. And the first of these is obviously performance. You want your models to perform well. You want your users to experience some good response times whenever they're inputting data. You want your imports and your exports to run efficiently. So we look at those, and we look at aspects where we know that these constructs are not as efficient in certain areas, and we try and tell you which ones to use and which ones not to. We want the users to be able to use your product, use your application that you're giving to them. So it's all very well having a really super fast product. If it's horrible for them to use, they're not going to be very happy. So you have to look at that. You have to make it easy to understand. You have to make it that it's logical. And finally, you have to make sure that this is sustainable and thinking about the future. You're not just modeling now, you're modeling for the future as well. Things change. If anyone who says something isn't going to change, then they're not telling the truth. Because we know in this world, everything changes, and it changes often. So you have to build for the future, think about what might happen. It might not happen, but it probably will. So plans is essentially the standard. And we looked at, in terms of acronyms, that was one of the main ones we wanted to put out there first of all. And again, we'll go through the sections of what that actually means now. So again, as we said, performance is the key part. It's the beginning of the word, and it's where you really do start. What I would say, though, is the good thing is if you adopt the standards that we're going to go through in a second, you don't have to work that hard. Performance kind of comes naturally. As you go through the rest of the standards, the performance aspects just come with those. Yes, there's certain aspects, certain functions, certain techniques that we know are more heavy on the performance than others, but essentially the rest of it is just a byproduct. So the next part is the logical, it's the L. And you may have heard of Disco. It's one of the first things we tried to get out there, which is around building your modules in a logical way and trying to model in a natural way and a more logical sort of structure within your models. We want you to use the dimensions and multidimensionality of Anaplan. That's what the tool is. We see a lot of models out there where we've moved away from that natural way of modeling, and surprise, surprise, the performance gets impaired. We want it to be understandable. So when you walk away, and this is particularly important for partners, but if you're a customer administrator and you move jobs or you move roles in your department, you want someone to pick that model up. You want them to understand what you've left them. So you can use the notes to document the why. That's a new innovation we've had in the last few years, which is very helpful. But we also want you to break things up. So break these long formulas down, break the models up into logical places, logical chunks, so someone can understand where the calculations are, where the inputs are. That's the kind of premise of the auditability. Nobody wants to work harder than they have to, and our engine is exactly the same. So why do calculations more than once? You want to put them in the right places. Why calculate over more dimensions than you want to? Essentially, we want to make sure that you're only doing what you need to do, and the engine wants to do the same thing. So where we can, we try and turn the summaries off, so we don't need them. We put calculations only using the dimensions that are necessary to actually give you the right result. And finally, touching on that S again, we want it to be sustainable. Try to avoid hard coding, using different techniques to make sure it's flexible just in case something changes. And if your management want to change their minds on a driver or an assumption, you can make a very quick change. You may even put that in the hands of the users so they can make that change themselves. So the Planual is there. It's a physical thing. It's on the web. If you Google it, it comes up first. So we are number one search for that. So if you get stuck and you don't know any links that are provided, you can just Google it. It's there. It's fantastic. So within that, though, the first part of it, and one of the things we'll go through in a second, is just the kind of key principles. So these aren't specific rules as such. These are just general guidelines. And those of you who know me know that I say all these things pretty much all the time. And this one I actually said before I joined Anaplan. I've been using different technologies for 20-odd years, doing the same sort of thing. And this still applies. And that kind of applies for the whole of the Planual, really. Is a lot of these are not Anaplan syntax. They're just good modeling guidelines that you can apply in pretty much anything that you do in any model. But obviously, we've tailored them specifically to Anaplan. So there are loads of ways you can model in Anaplan. A lot of them are the wrong way. So it's a question that we always ask when you're modeling. Should you really be doing that? Just because you can actually do it, and just because Anaplan will not give you an error, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way to model. We touched on it just now. Calculate once and then reference it. The way Anaplan works when it opens up the model is it does all the calculations everywhere. It's a consistency across every single cell in your model so that everybody, whoever they are, whatever the role, whatever intersection of the data they're looking at, it's the same number. And then it increments based on what people do. It's why the engine is so efficient. That's the design of the engine in the back end. So you want to use that to your advantage. Why do calculations over and over when you can do them all at the beginning? But that will only work if you actually do the calculations once and then reference them. If you put the same expression in lots of places, it will calculate lots of times. So you want to use that to your advantage. Use the calculation mode and just, again, make sure that you're only calculating what you need to. Why overcomplicate anything? Some of the formulas we see get records for the wrong reasons. It's not a prize for building the longest formula that you can. It's actually the other way around. And back to my first point, if you model naturally and you model with the structures in Anaplan, you don't need long formulas. You really don't. You should be able to use the structures to do the work for you because it is a very simple modeling tool. So when some of the ones that we see and it takes you a day to work out what that formula is doing, it's too long. As we said, if it falls off the bottom of the formula editor, it's too long. So think about your formulas, and if you start getting it that big, you need to start thinking about breaking it up. Only calculate what you need to. So again, using calculation modules, summary options don't need to be on most of the time. Use the right dimensions. So don't do a calculation that only changes by time in a module dimension by customers and products, because it's just doing it for no reason. This is probably the most controversial comment in the last few years. It's not always a problem to have sparse modules. And as we'll go through in a few more details later, sometimes it's actually the best approach. It's the smallest approach and the fastest approach. So when I started, you eliminated it, you got rid of it. It was everything you did to try and get rid of all the sparsity you had in your models, which goes back to my first point. It's not natural the way Anaplan wants to work. It's moving away from the way it wants to work, so performance suffers sometimes. So it's a balance. Sometimes you have to, sometimes you don't. And that's the point of this is don't just jump straight to the elimination of it until you've actually considered the alternatives. Don't compromise your functionality for the users because you've been told you've got to get rid of sparsity. Coming on that point, it's sometimes better to be slightly bigger and quicker than try and make it smaller and slower. Most end users don't know how big the model is, so they just want performance. So we've seen correlations between models, and it's not bigger equals smaller, bigger equals slower, sorry. It varies. It depends on how you build it. Some of the worst performing models we see are the smallest models we see. So you can't say just because it's big means it's going to be slow. That's not true. And in computing speak, for those geeks out there, Booleans are great. They are 1 or 0, that's it. They are the most efficient structure you can use in anything, and nothing's different in Anaplan. So we want you to try and use that sort of functionality where you can. Text is the opposite. Text is the worst structure we can use from a computing point of view because it uses more memory. So again, we now know the impact text has, and we'll touch on one of those in a second. Just be careful with using text. Try to avoid it where you can. And in particular, try to stop joining text together. So again, we'll touch on it in more details, but joining text increases that impact. So we try to do as much work as we can in terms of joining text outside of Anaplan, because just because we can doesn't mean we should. I see this a lot with a lot of our models. People want to do everything, and they want to do everything for every single part of the business. And sometimes that exception drives so much complexity that it impacts the rest of the main part of the model. And the rest of the users who don't care about that little one thing that might happen some point maybe, it ends up impacting the models. Sometimes you have to just let the manager do their job and actually give them the ones that don't fit the pattern and say, sorry, you've got to work this out yourself. But you can do it in a way, and you can provide them with the dashboards, you can provide them with the exception reporting that says, these ones don't work, you need to work out what to do with these because we tried to model it as best we could and these don't fit. If you try to sanitize the numbers too much, you find you affect everything else. So don't model, model exceptions as exceptions. Don't let them drive the rest of the complexity in your model. And finally, one of the transformational elements of Anaplan and the ability to use the sum and the lookup formula are fundamental to the way we build. We can have different structures throughout the model. We can have the most appropriate structures throughout the model. And sum and lookup you do need to master to be able to model properly. But using them in the same construct can lead to large intermediate calculations, which means you get the performance impact. So back to the whole premise of breaking things up, making them more logical. This is one of those that we know is a performance impact. So we say break it into two pieces and you'll see a big improvement in your performance. It does potentially mean your model might be slightly larger, but it will perform better. So again, it's this compromise. If you know the risks and you know the connotations of your choices, you can make a better decision about modeling. So they're the general guidelines. Let's drill into some of them without going into specific rule numbers. I'm not that much of a geek that I can remember what 2.0, 0.4 or whatever is, but there's some big principles. And these are the kind of big takeaways. And if you've looked on community, you'll have seen we've written a lot of articles around some of these over the last year. So the references for those will be available afterwards. But if you go to the main plans page within community, all of these articles are listed at the bottom. So you can easily navigate to the actual more detail here. We're only going to go into a summary view at this point. And this is, again, slightly controversial in one sense in that we have two ways of doing things. So they are essentially the same things, but we're trying to move away from using one construct. We're trying to unify how we model. And as you can see on there, I'm not going to go into all of them in detail, but there are functionality gaps of using list properties over line items. So the challenge that we face with some of these is there's two ways of doing things. So we find people who prefix their lists with an L so that they know that it's a list property. Because in a formula, there is no way really of knowing. If you follow our naming conventions, which are in the book, then you should know, but it's quite easy. Products.segment. Is that a module called products or a list called products? I have no idea. You just don't know. So people put an L in front of it, which again is unnecessary. It's not really following what you need to. So for us, it's just unify one way of doing things. List properties are essentially one-dimensional, but sometimes they become two-dimensional. Because if you've got a cost center rolling up into a department, what happens next month if it changes? Or in the future it might change. So you end up repeating the data. So going back to the calculate once and reference many times, you're moving that data into a multi-dimensional module, so you're now doing the calculation effectively twice. Well, if you started in a module, you're not doing it twice. So this is kind of why we're trying to sort of encourage you. You have to in some cases. And throughout the Planual, there are exceptions. There are reasons why you have to go and do certain things, and list properties is some of those. But just to clarify, they are the same thing. They work in the same way. They take up the same amount of space. They take the same amount of time to open up. Again, in terms of the myths, they're treated exactly the same way in the engine underneath the surface. There's no differences between them. So for me, simplify everything. Simplify as we event is one of our values in Anaplan. Let's just keep it simple. Use one way, so you don't have to worry about which one it is. It's just a line item. It always will be. The other one, again, just because we can doesn't mean we necessarily should. This is at the heart of Disco in terms of trying to make your modules sole purpose, trying to explain what that module is doing. You could build your Anaplan models in about 10 modules probably for the whole thing, and some of the modules we see out in the field, every single line is a different dimensionality. So it's really difficult to actually understand what it's doing. And again, to clarify, if you put that module line item in a separate module as opposed to a subsidiary view, there is no difference in performance because the line item is essentially where the calculation is done. Modules from the calculation perspective are purely just containers to hold the calculation. When it does the actual engine calc, it is just that line item level. So it doesn't really care where it came from. So you can get confusion around the modules. You don't actually know what this module is doing because it kind of does everything. Now, for some people, they say, it's great. I know where everything is. That's fine until you move on. And then someone else comes in and has no idea. But one of the things that we see a lot, and I kind of win the bet most times when I challenge people on this, is because it's not the logical place to put that calculation, it is very likely that calculation will exist somewhere else, particularly if you've got multiple developers. Because they may be looking for a calculation and they look at the module and they go, well, it won't be in there. So then they go and build it somewhere else. So we see it often where the same expression is in multiple places, which means you're doing the calculation more than once. So for me, this actually leads to a performance sort of degradation rather than a benefit, because you will see more calculations in there. So removing them gives you that clarity of a view. It gives you, you know what that module is. And actually it makes maintenance easier. We'll talk about a few techniques in a minute. But actually, if you know that your module is defined by a set of dimensions and that's it, every single line item is the same, then you can easily see from the blueprint view what the dimensionality is. You don't have to dive into the module and look at the line items themselves. And again, there are some exceptions where we have to use them for reporting and exporting, etc. But generally, try to think of it. And it doesn't mean that you have to have one module for every single set of calculations. You're grouping the stuff together. So you can have sets of calculations in the same module as long as they're all the same dimensionality. That's a logical place to go for calculations that are customer products by time. You know where to go. It's a calculation module, it's customer products on time, somewhere in there is going to be the calculation that I need. If it's not there, fine, then I put it there, because it's the logical place to put it, for somebody else to find it if they need it. So on that topic of applies to and subsidiary viewing, one of the things that we found out a few years ago, and it kind of was the start of us telling people need to know this, was dimensionality of a module can affect the performance of a calculation when you're trying to do the same calculations from one module or one line item to another line item. So in our example there where we said customers, products and time, if we were multiplying that by another line item that was products, customers and time, that's not as efficient because the engine does an indexing in the background. And what it does is it doesn't kind of know what's coming next because they're in a different order. So the more dimensions that are common in the same order, the engine knows what's coming. So it's a technical thing called prefetch, but effectively it knows what's coming next, so it's gone and got all the information it needs before it needs to do the calculation, which means it can be up to 5 or 6 times faster, and it makes no difference to anything. It makes no difference to your views, to your exports, to your performance, to your size. It's an absolute no-brainer. And it's, again, back to the subsidiary view conversation, you can literally go down your blueprint, click the 3 ellipses, and it will reset the order to be consistent. But it's also part of the understanding. If your business talks about customers and products, then put customers first all the time. There is not as much correlation between biggest to smallest or smallest to biggest, because that depends on the data. So we've seen conflicting reports. So we haven't given guidance on biggest to smallest or smallest to biggest, because the logical way you should set up your hierarchies in your lists is a parent to child relationship, which means by definition you'll be putting the smallest at the top, because you'll be putting regions, then countries, then cities. So if you decided you want to do it the other way around, you don't really want your hierarchy to be inverted. That doesn't make sense. So the guidance is be consistent and do it everywhere. And even in things like the sum formulas and the lookup formulas, that has no effect, but still be consistent. Always put customers first. It's just easier to understand. We've talked quite a lot already about how to break things up, and this is at the heart of what we do now. The engine likes it when it's split up. So breaking up formulas, breaking up constructs, if you imagine every time you've got a plus or a minus or a divide by, really you've got to consider whether you want that in that same formula, because the more of the calculation that's done in one place, the less the engine can actually pre-calculate or calculate once and reference it. So there's no intermediary calculations, there's no subtotals. So it doesn't know what that value was that's now part of a bigger calculation. So it has no way of storing that intermediary calculation for you. So by breaking it up, particularly for ones that don't change very often. So when the model loads up, if there's a big calculation and then it loads it and calculates it, if that's in a separate line item, it never has to calculate it again. If you put that calculation as part of a bigger grouping, it has to calculate it again. So the larger calculations or the more infrequent calculations, you want to just get those out of the way. Just get them done and dusted, and then effectively the engine says, oh, I know what that is. I don't have to recalculate it. And it will then be able to use the processing that we have in the back end to spread the calculations out. The more elements that it can do in parallel, the better for you, and the shorter the time that you will see in your calculations. So it also makes it easy to understand, and it also makes it easy to amend, because you've got different formulas broken up into different sections. So back to that point about formulas falling off the formula bar, break them up into 2 or 3. And back to the point about calculations, if you do break that formula up into 2 pieces, turn the summaries off because you don't need them, because you've broken it up. So A plus B, you've already broken the detail out. So the detail to detail means you don't need summaries. So it won't have as big an impact as you might think for breaking line items up, because there's always a conscious, okay, this makes my model bigger. It may not be quite as bad as you think. And actually, if you adopt some of the other techniques we talk about in the Planual, it will make your model smaller in the first place anyway. So you've got a bit more space to play with. We talked a little bit, this word appropriate I've been using quite a lot recently, and I think that's the best way to describe it. The example I gave earlier was really look at what the expression actually needs to come up with the result. Anaplan will give you the result anyway, and you don't notice the difference, you don't know what it's doing in the background. But if it doesn't need to have that element of a dimension in the calculation, then it shouldn't be in there. And it overcalculates, and you don't know that it's doing it because it doesn't tell you. So when you're doing each expression and each comparison or each plus or minus, have a look at what the applies to is on the line item, and have a look at what the line item really needs to be for that expression. And if you find that it's actually got more dimensions in the applies to than it really needs for the expression, take that expression out, put it into a module that is actually for those dimensions, and then reference it as part of the formula. So it hits all those things we just talked about. It's appropriate, it's calculated once, it's referenced many times, much, much more efficient. The big enemy that we talked about is text and joining text. And exactly onto that point, it flows perfectly onto where we just were. Look at where you have to do a join. We know that you have to do a join. Anaplan is optimized for numbers, and if you use text and strings in particular, it can increase the memory overhead, and we can see poor performance leading from that. But we have to still use it. So we want to try and minimize where we use it and minimize the joins. So if you're joining customers and products together, and with a symbol or an underscore or something, and you've got 5 customers and 1,000 products, do the join in the customer side, because there's only 5 joins. If you do the join in the product side, you've got 1,000 joins. If you do the join in the customers by products, you've got 5 million joins or whatever. So that's the technique that we say, do the join in the smallest possible place, and you mitigate the impact of the text. So as I said, we have to use it, but be careful. There's an article that demonstrates exactly that. We put it in our training courses now to make sure that we cover this so you can see the technique. And again, that's a really easy one because it doesn't take up a lot more space. It doesn't affect your overall calculations at the end. It doesn't mean you've got to change your code structures. It just means the way you construct that join is much, much more efficient than it used to be. The other probably big learning that we found was since doing this is just coming back to that sparsity point, and this was the big one where we've said, okay, this needs to be said, is transaction data or bringing data into a data hub where we have time-based information and a lot of detail, a lot of combinations in a structure. So customers, account codes, cost centers, we've got 3 or 4, 5, sometimes even 10 elements that make up a string. We always were told, based on the sparsity conversation, to get rid of the time and make sure that time was part of these rows as well. And one of the findings that when we switched it around and said, well, what happens if we made it in a module and put our time going effectively across as opposed to down? Lists themselves take up a lot of space. Just the list member, about 60 times more than just having a normal line item. So what we found was that where you have repetition, so assuming you've got weekly data and there's a value in most of the weeks, you're going to have 40 to 50 rows that effectively have the same information in all the way through. The only thing that's changing is the month or the week and the values. Whereas if you take that element out, you reduce those 40 or 50 rows down to 1 row, and then you spin it across in terms of a module. And yes, your cell count goes up because you've got more cells, but it doesn't cost as much in terms of space. And the bigger impact on this one that we've seen is by doing that, particularly where you have got granular data, so daily data or weekly data, we're seeing 80 to 90% savings on size. The worst we've seen at the moment in real life is 80%. Most of the time it's 90 or plus. So you can massively save size, and surprise, surprise, because of that, you massively save opening times and calculation times. It's a huge, huge win. And again, my colleague from the Operational Excellence Group, Rob Marshall, he presented this at CPX in San Francisco. There's a video online of that. There's also an article that we converted the presentation into. So that really gives you a worked example of the impact. And it's really easy for you to check it. Use your data, strip out the code of the time, work out how many of those combinations you actually have, I mean, we've seen millions of rows of data go down to thousands, and you times that by 500, you can see the effect, because it's kind of hidden, because lists themselves don't count for cell counts, but they do count for gigabytes. So be aware of it, have a look at it, try it out. I think a lot of the things we've talked about up to now, try it and see. You might surprise yourself. We certainly did when we tried some of these. And finally, we're looking at sustainability. It's the S part of it. I mean, this is good modeling anyway. You should be doing this in your spreadsheets and any other system. This isn't just Anaplan. Try to avoid hard coding things, particularly on timescales. We see a lot of select FY19. Now, the problem with that is if you roll the model over, one, you may not be able to roll the model over because 19 may not be there anymore. Or if it does roll it over, 19 may not be where it's supposed to be. It may need to be 20. So, try to use generic time areas like year to date or current period, things like that, which are flexible, because you don't necessarily know as a model builder whether your answers are going to give you the right results or not, because if someone's done that and you're not aware. It also has impact with ALM, using select on certain lists. You can't use application lifecycle. You can't push that out. And lookups do the same thing. In most cases, lookups will give you exactly the same result, same performance. They work slightly differently, but there's no material difference between the two in terms of calculations. But what it means is you now can be flexible. So at the moment, somebody might want to look at this department as part of the results. But what if they change their mind? If you've got a select statement, you've got to find every single calculation where that select statement exists and change it. As an admin, you shouldn't need to go to the blueprint to change your formulas if requirements in the business change. You should be able to do those through a dashboard yourself. So even if you have a single module with no dimensions in it, with a whole load of formatted values that you can choose, you now make that model flexible. So all of your assumptions, all of your tax rates, all of your general commission rates go in one place. And then you can adapt if it needs to. So if you decide that you've got a global commission rate and you want to now vary it by country, fine. Instead of having a hard-coded 10% in all your formulas, you've got a module line item. You make that module dimension by country, and you change the formula downstream to say, now pick it up the country specific. So you're building for the future, as we said. So apart from us telling you that you should do this, it's not an ego trip. It's not us kind of saying we're better than anybody. We've actually built this off real life situations. Most of this has come from the work that our support team do in York, where customers say, we have a problem with our model, be it opening time, be it calculations, be it falling over, whatever it might be. And they can identify the problem. And that's what happened when we started doing this 2 years ago, was we were looking at problems and then saying, well, we've now fixed it. And then we said, well, what happens if I did it that way? Because as we said at the outset, there are a number of ways we can solve the problem. The one that they've come to us with obviously worked, but didn't work very well. That's why they actually asked for us to fix it. So we started looking at what happens if I do it A or B. And we kind of did that for every single thing that we knew about. What would happen if we tried something? The questions that we got from customers and master Anaplanners and product people and internal was, okay, what's the best way of doing this? And if we didn't know, we tested it and we checked it with the facts. So if you follow this through, you've got lots of things that we can see in the field. We do this a lot. We see genuine results. So I'm not going to go through all of the details that are on here, but I'll give you some real life examples. And it touches on all the points that we've just done. We, by changing some formulas in the model, took a 90 gigabyte model, so one of our larger models that we see out there, and it was 11 minutes to open it. By making some small changes to some formulas, we got that down to 2 minutes. The model was I think it was a fraction bigger, it might have been 1% bigger, because we had to break the formulas up slightly. But it was 9 minutes quicker. So as in anyone's trade-off, I'll go 1% bigger for about whatever that maths is, 70, 80% faster. We've seen one formula that when a user typed in an assumption, it was taking 30 seconds, which is unacceptable from a user experience perspective. We looked at the formulas and we found, again, it was combined with 2 or 3 constructs in one place. We split those out, and we actually found that one of those constructs was used elsewhere, so we didn't even need to make it any bigger. We could just change the formula around. That calculation now runs in sub-second. No change to anything else, just 2 formulas changed. And when you combine all these together, I did some work recently with a customer, and they had lots of things going on. They had input processes, they had calculations in there, they had suboptimal formulas. And the process for the users was really terrific. They were having to wait 15 minutes because there was a backlog of the blocks and everything. We changed the way we approached everything. So we changed a few processes, we changed a few calculations. We just changed the way they worked slightly, so it wasn't exactly everything that they were doing before, Because one of the things that we have to get across is Anaplan is not Excel. So sometimes you have to change the way you work slightly. And we got them to understand that. And we proved that by doing it this way, it was a minute. So it was always a minute. So they couldn't get sub-second response times every time they did anything, but they only had to wait a minute. And it was consistently a minute, as opposed to being 15 minutes. So sometimes you have to take the balance, and you have to do that education to your users to say, okay, this is what you're used to, but this is not how Anaplan works. We want to build the models in the right way for you, that work optimally for you, based on everything. And often, you can give them an approach which is close enough to what they really want. We often ask that question, what problem are you actually trying to solve, not what do you think you're trying to do? And that's how you get around the problems, because you can be creative and you can come up with solutions and you can try it. You know, you try things and see. You can, you know, you don't necessarily need our lab to tell you if it's quick enough. You can time it with a stopwatch sometimes. You know, it's 30 seconds now. You change something, does it take 30 seconds? You know, that's a big enough change that you can see. Some of the things we talked about here and we do on some of the training courses and the guidance we give on community, they're going to make 1 second difference. You may not notice it, but you multiply those 1 seconds up everywhere, it makes a big difference. So for me, it's the difference between a user saying it's a bit slow and actually it's fine. You know, you do that regularly. So my ask to you is open it, look at it, read it, download it, you know, not maybe in one go, but you know, take some guidance in there. A lot of the stuff in there, as we said, is general guidelines. You know, the link is there. As I said, you can Google it, you can find it. It's on community. You know, we are going to update it. We're looking to get something out by the end of the year. So this is where we need your help. We need your feedback. We want to know what you want to know, because there's things that you know, use cases that you may be using we're not aware of. We want to know if it's better to do A or B. That's what we've done a lot of. We've tried to catch as much of that as we can. So give us some help to help you. So with that, I think it's over to some questions that may have come in. And we'll be back in 5. Okay, so we got some questions from the field. The first one of those was around the 10 key principles, and it's saying, what are the biggest mistakes that we see in model building? I've been told I've got about 15 minutes. I could probably spend 15 minutes talking about how many mistakes we see in model building, but that's probably not fair. I think the biggest one we see is where people try to use the techniques they've used in other systems. So they're used to building in Excel, or they're used to building in other software, and I did the same. You know, I've used 3 or 4 different things, and you have to accept that Anaplan is not the same as what you had before. And one of the things that we've taught people over the years, and I was taught it at school with languages, and I think it's exactly the same here with model building, is if you're going to become proficient in a language, you have to think in that language. You have to practice in that language. You don't translate your native language into the foreign language. So certain languages have constructs in their verbs at the end of sentences instead of the beginning of sentences. So if you write and translate in your head English to German, you will be understood, but it's not good German, or Japanese is similar, I think, or any language. And it's the same thing with Anaplan. If you think in Excel and try and build Excel in Anaplan, it will work, and we see it work, and then you'll be calling our York office going, it's not working very well, can you fix it? And when we see some of the structures, you kind of ask the question, why are you building it like that? And it's because they don't really understand the structures and the way Anaplan works, because we have dimensions and multidimensionality. And as I said at the outset, we can do things differently. It's a big difference in Anaplan to the other products is we don't have to use the same structures throughout. We can use different structures. We can map them. We can aggregate without hierarchies. These are all things that you can't do in other products. So accept the fact that it's not the same as what you're used to. Don't try and build it like you used to, because you'll get something that works, but it's not going to work You know, those that know me know my analogies. It's like playing cricket with a tennis racket. You probably could do it. You wouldn't last very long, and it's the same sort of thing, yeah? So, and it leads in quite nicely to Uzma's question that we've had about new model building training that are coming. And actually, for me, this is where we have to accept the fact that, you know, we need to make sure we teach you the right way. So we don't want you to not understand the constructs in Anaplan. We don't want to leave it to you to just, here you are, here's Anaplan, off you go. Because in some sense, it's like that. You start with nothing. There's no guidance at the beginning to say what you're supposed to do. It's a blank piece of paper. So the new training that we've done, which is level 2 and level 1 and level 2 are out there. So if you are a model builder, I would definitely encourage you to go and retake it, because we've changed our approach. We've done a lot more of the best practices. All of the other things we talked about here are embedded from the beginning. But it also explains how Anaplan works. It explains these structures. It explains the way you can do things and the pitfalls of going other routes. So by using the training and unlearning some of the things, so those of you who've been around a while, absolutely, we need to accept it. I built things the wrong way as well. We did it the way we did it 3-4 years ago because that's all we knew. We now know differently. So we have to accept the fact that it's now changed. The best practices have changed. The advice has changed. We've understood more of the product. So just because it worked before doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to carry on going. You know, we're now explaining the right ways to do things, and the training will help you. So for new starters, I think it's fantastic because it really explains how to model properly. It's taking simple use cases, it's giving you the worked examples that you can go back to, it's showing you how to use some of the more complicated areas of Anaplan, yes, but you need to know those, how to model. Some of the problems we see are because people don't understand how to use a lookup, for example. So we see these massively nested if statements where a lookup is really simple. So we've taught people how to use a lookup, because actually the construct, once you get your head around it, it's actually quite simple and it's incredibly powerful, and you can build really efficiently with it. So one of the questions, and this is kind of just going through as I'm talking, it's about using lookups versus select. So this isn't scripted, honestly. This is the order they've come in. Does it work when referring to parents in a list? Now, yes and no is the answer. The other phrase I always say is it depends, but this one is, if it's a composite list, so what I mean by that is if you have lists that are parents and then children that are a part of that hierarchy. So region is a list on its own, countries is a list on its own, cities is a list on its own. Lookups work perfectly okay on those because of the way the structure is. If that is all one list and it's not something we advise, because you can't model very well, and again, this is one of the things we see where people come from other systems, is they build one list called cities, and everything has it, it's in there with everything. So you can build a parent in that list, and you can build a grandparent in that list, and etc. But you can't model just region, because it's all part of the same list. So we don't advise you doing that, but if you do, lookups are a problem in that they don't return the values. But there are some techniques out there, and we can provide the links to them, where you can actually, using another module, bring the data out and effectively do the same thing. So you can't directly point at it, but you can actually get the result you need, which means you can avoid using the select, which does mean it opens up things like ALM for costs. It generally tends to be chart of accounts, where it's kind of a bit of a ragged, messy hierarchy, if you like. That's the problems we see, but it is possible. Like most things, there is a way around it. There's not many things we can't do, and that's one of the ones where the workaround is a little bit tricky, but actually it still will get you to the right result. Sometimes the right result isn't to take the easy option. You actually have to think about what it means if you could solve that problem. Okay, so last couple. What was the biggest aha moment when creating the Planual? I think there's probably two. I think the dimension order was the one that our chief architect told us about that once in a kind of throwaway comment in one of our product customer success, and a few of us who went, whoa, back up, hang on, what did you just say? For me, that was something that we all should have known from day one, which was huge. But I think the other one probably is the data staging one. That really was why is this better this much? We kind of expected that technique might be faster because of the calculation engine. What we didn't expect was it to be that much smaller as well. And that's when we dug into that and said, well, again, and what's happened with the way that we developed the product is there's been an assumption from the beginning about how people would use it, and therefore there's some information that's provided around, cell count, people build modules, that's what they expect to see. we weren't expecting people to use the size of lists and the detail that we've seen. So we didn't account for the list sizes in the metrics that you see necessarily. So it's still there, you can still see it. There's nothing deliberately hidden. It just wasn't a massive consideration because the assumption was modules and cell counts is visible. That's what you want to see. That's what everyone wants to do. So it was that we kind of went, okay, now we understand it. And once you explain it and understand it, it's easy. You can really see the effect. So it gives us the guidance. It says, okay, now that we know this, we'll tell you, so now you can make those decisions. Can you give us a sneak peek of what's to come in the updated Planual? I think the biggest one for me on that one is we tried to get out for CPX in San Francisco in June, so there was a few late entries that we wanted to get in. We thought we need to get these in and get it completed. So for me, and the feedback that we've had from some people, which has been fantastic, is why? There's a few things where we just tell you to do it, and we don't actually say why, which is a fair comment. So we're going to put a bit more color around why we're saying what we're saying and what the impact might be. So that's the biggest change. And there's a few other ones. There's a little bit on versions that we've seen, which you may have seen the article we did around if you're using versions heavily versus not using versions. And so there's a few of those where we're going to add to them. There's a couple of them that now that the platform itself has changed, probably are not as relevant anymore, so we can take some of those out. But we will put at the beginning what's changed. We're not going to make you do a before and after. That would be too cruel. So we'll put a kind of updated view. This is the appended thing and everything else, and then we'll put that up. I'm hoping to try and get that out by the end of the year, so we can have a V2 from there. But as I said, we really do need your feedback as to what you want to know, what do you not understand, because that will help guide me. You know, some of the feedback we've had has been brilliant, where people said, well, I do this. Why is that not a good idea? That really helps. So put the comments on the Planual, feed it back to us, and then we can make this. We want to make this as complete for you as possible. It's not a document for me. It's a document for you. So I want you to get the best out of Anaplan and you to help us facilitate that. So the final question, will the Planual help me become a master Anaplanner? That's a really simple question, simple answer to that one. Yes, it will, because, surprise, surprise, a lot of the master Anaplanner questions are based on the Planual rules. So, and given that I write some of the rules, yes, it will. So if you read it and implement it and understand it, absolutely it will help you. Not that that's the only place you've got to go, but it will certainly help you if you have a copy to hand, because it will definitely tell you some clues. So thank you for the questions, thank you for your attention. It's been fantastic to talk to you today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of User Groups Live.